April 29, 1945, 7:14 a.m. An American soldier raises his rifle and shoots an SS guard point blank in the skull. The body drops. Another soldier fires. Then another. Then another. Within 20 minutes, 50 Nazi guards lay dead in the dirt, not killed in combat, not cut down while fighting back, but executed. Cold, deliberate, one by one. And the man who covered it up was one of the most decorated generals in American history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. We're building a community of history lovers who want the truth, the complicated, uncomfortable, unforgettable truth. What you're about to hear is not a story of clear heroes and clear villains. It's something far more dangerous than that. It's a story about the moment when justice, law, and basic human decency all walked into the same room and couldn't agree on a single thing. 50 SS guards. 50 executions. 0 prosecutions. And one general who looked the entire American military justice system in the eye and said, "I will not do it." His name was George S. Patton. And on that April morning in Bavaria, he made a decision that history is still arguing about. But to understand what Patton did, you first have to understand what his soldiers walked into, because nothing prepares you for Dachau. The 45th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Thunderbirds, had been fighting across Europe since 1943. Sicily, Italy, southern France, the Rhine. 2 years of grinding, brutal combat that had turned farm boys and factory workers into hardened veterans. These were men who had watched their friends bleed out in ditches, who had taken fire in snowstorms, who had cleared buildings room by room, knowing every doorway might be their last. They had seen war. They genuinely believed, that they had already witnessed the worst that human beings could do to each other. They were wrong. When the lead elements of the 45th pushed through the gates of Dachau Concentration Camp on the morning of April 29, 1945. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Not the smell of combat gunpowder and blood and diesel fuel, but something older and heavier and more total. It was the smell of 12 years of organized murder baked into the soil, rising from the buildings, clinging to every surface of that place like it had become part of the architecture itself. Then they saw the rail cars. 39 cattle cars sitting on the tracks just inside the gate. Each one packed with bodies. Not one or two. Not a dozen. Thousands. Stacked on top of each other like they had been cargo. Men, women, the occasional child. Skeletal. Frozen in whatever position death had found them. Some had been dead for days. Some for weeks. The cars had simply sat there unmoved as Germany collapsed around them, and nobody had bothered to do anything with them, because to the people who ran Dachau, these bodies were already nothing. Private John Lee, one of the first soldiers through the gate, said later, "We thought we knew what evil looked like. We'd been fighting it for 2 years, but this was something else. This was hell on earth." Inside the camp, 30,000 prisoners were still alive. Barely. They moved in slow motion, if they moved at all, skeletal figures in filthy striped uniforms. Eyes enormous in faces that were nothing but hollowed bone. Some unable to stand. Some too far gone to understand that the Americans were there to help them. Soldiers who had never cried in combat stood in the middle of that camp and wept openly. Veterans who had seen entire units destroyed, who had pulled friends' bodies from burning vehicles, found themselves unable to speak. The gas chambers were still warm. The crematoria contained human remains. The medical experimentation rooms were exactly what they sounded like. The punishment cells, tiny stone boxes where prisoners had been locked without food or water until they died, still had scratch marks on the walls. Dachau had opened in 1933. For 12 years, this machine had been running. Over 40,000 people had died inside those fences. And the men who ran it were still there. Approximately 50 SS guards had not fled when the Americans approached. Some had been too arrogant to believe they needed to run. Others had nowhere to go. A few, according to witness accounts, appeared genuinely confused about why anyone would be upset with them. When the American soldiers poured through the gate, these 50 men dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Under the Geneva Convention, that gesture meant everything. The moment a combatant surrenders, they become a prisoner of war. They are entitled to humane treatment, due process, protection from violence. The law is clear. It has to be clear because the alternative is a world where surrender means nothing and wars never end. The American soldiers at Dachau were not thinking about the Geneva Convention. They were looking at the rail cars. What happened next was not ordered. It was not coordinated. It was not the result of any command decision or tactical calculation. It was something rawer and older than military procedure. It was human beings pushed past the absolute outer limit of what the mind can process, responding in the only language that felt equal to what they were seeing. One soldier raised his rifle and fired. Then another. Then another. Some of the SS guards tried to run and were shot in the back. Others dropped to their knees and begged and were shot anyway. A few were beaten to death. It lasted approximately 20 minutes. When it was over, all 50 guards were dead. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding officer of one of the battalions present, had physically intervened before the killing was complete. He put his own body between his soldiers, and the remaining guards screamed at his men to stop, threatened to shoot anyone who fired another round. He managed to halt the executions before every last prisoner had been reached. But the damage was already done, and everyone present knew it. This was murder, not combat, not self-defense, not collateral damage or the fog of war. American soldiers had executed surrendered prisoners. It was a war crime by any legal definition, under any interpretation of international law, full stop. The report traveled up the chain of command with the speed that serious problems always travel fast. Division headquarters, Corps headquarters, Army headquarters, and then, inevitably, to a desk in Bavaria, where a 3-star general sat surrounded by photographs he had personally ordered taken of everything inside Dachau's gates. George S. Patton had arrived at Dachau the day after liberation. He had walked the same path his soldiers had walked, seen the same rail cars, smelled the same air. At one point during his inspection, this man who had commanded armies across 2 continents, who had never by any account displayed anything resembling physical weakness, walked out of one of the barracks and vomited in the dirt. He ordered German civilians from the nearby town of Dachau to be brought to the camp and forced to see it themselves, forced to walk past the bodies and the gas chambers and the crematoria. He wanted them to understand what had been done in their name on their doorstep while they looked the other direction for 12 years. Then the report about his soldiers landed on his desk. The Inspector General's office wanted a full investigation. The Judge Advocate General's office wanted court-martials. Even Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, weighed in. This cannot be covered up. His message said, "We cannot become what we're fighting against." The pressure was clear, and it was enormous. Prosecute. Punish. Restore the rule of law that separated the Allied cause from the thing it had spent 4 years fighting. Patton read the investigation. He read the witness statements. He looked at the photographs spread across his desk, both sets of photographs, the ones from the executions and the ones from inside the camp. He understood exactly what had happened and exactly what was being asked of him. And then he made his decision. His response to the Inspector General was careful in its wording and devastating in its intent. He wrote that the evidence was inconclusive, that in the chaos of camp liberation with thousands of prisoners, scattered guards and ongoing German resistance in the area, it was impossible to determine with certainty which deaths resulted from combat and which did not. It was technically not a lie. The liberation had been chaotic. There had been some German fire, but Patton knew, and everyone who read his response knew exactly what he was doing. He went further. He wrote that even if executions had occurred, the psychological state of soldiers who had just witnessed Dachau's full horror constituted a significant mitigating factor that temporary insanity was not an unreasonable conclusion for men exposed to evidence of crimes on that scale. He was building a legal shelter around his soldiers, brick by deliberate brick. And then he wrote the sentence that ended the conversation. I will not court-martial soldiers for killing SS guards at a death camp. If that makes me complicit in a war crime, so be it. But I will not destroy American soldiers for doing what I myself might have done in their place. What I myself might have done. That phrase landed like an artillery shell. Patton wasn't just protecting his men, he was placing himself alongside them. He was saying, I walked through those gates. I saw what they saw. And I cannot promise you that I would have acted differently. He was refusing to occupy the moral high ground while his soldiers stood in the mud below him. He was refusing to be a general who demands from his men a standard of conduct he would not hold himself to. The Inspector General's office was furious. Memos were drafted about obstruction. Arguments were prepared for Patton's removal. And then something very interesting happened. People at the highest levels of command began thinking through what a trial would actually look like. American soldiers on a witness stand describing in detail what they saw inside Dachau. Defense attorneys calling Holocaust survivors to testify. Photographs of gas chambers and mass graves entered into evidence. The verdict, guilty or not guilty, almost didn't matter. The trial itself would force the American military justice system into an impossible position that no outcome could resolve cleanly. The investigation went quiet. Paperwork accumulated around it. It was classified, marked inconclusive, and buried. The soldiers who had fired those shots went home to their families. They lived their lives. None of them ever faced a court-martial. In his private diary, Patton wrote words that cut to the bone of everything. I cannot condemn men for doing in passion what the world should have done in policy years ago. If killing SS guards is a crime, then we are all criminals for not stopping the camp sooner. That might be the most honest sentence written by anyone in authority about Dachau. Not a defense of what happened, not a celebration of it. Just a reckoning with the fact that the world had allowed Dachau to exist for 12 years and then expected 20-year-old soldiers to maintain legal composure when they finally saw it. But here is what Patton could not have known as he sat at that desk in Bavaria in the spring of 1945. The decision he made that day to protect his soldiers to choose human understanding over institutional law would echo far beyond the gates of Dachau. Because the questions his decision raised did not die with the investigation. They survived the war. They survived the Nuremberg trials. They survived into every subsequent debate about justice rules of engagement and the limits of what law can ask of human beings in conditions law was never designed to address. And there was one person watching all of this, one soldier who had been present that morning, who had participated in what happened, and who would spend the next 50 years unable to decide whether Patton had saved him or simply delayed a reckoning that was always coming. His name was James Donahue. He had been a welder from Pittsburgh before the war. He was 23 years old on April 29, 1945. And what he carried home from Dachau would follow him every day for the rest of his life. In Part 2, we go inside the mind of the men who pulled the trigger. What they saw, what they felt, and what happened when one of them finally decided to tell the full truth decades later. Because the story of Dachau doesn't end with Patton's memo. It ends with a confession that nobody expected from a man who had kept silent for half a century, and what he said changed everything we thought we knew about that morning. Patton had buried the investigation. 50 SS guards executed in cold blood, and not a single American soldier faced a court-martial. The system had blinked first. But James Donahue, 23 years old, welder from Pittsburgh, one of the men who had raised his rifle that April morning, was about to discover that some things cannot be buried forever. Because 47 years after Dachau, a historian named Dr. Harold Marcus sent a letter to a retirement home in western Pennsylvania. And the man who received that letter had been waiting for it his entire adult life. In 1992, Marcus was completing what would become the definitive academic account of the Dachau liberation. He had tracked down 17 surviving soldiers who had been present on April 29, 1945. 16 of them declined to speak. The 17th was James Donahue. And when Marcus arrived at the retirement home on a Tuesday morning in October, Donahue was sitting in a chair by the window with a folder on his lap that he had kept locked in a filing cabinet for nearly 5 decades. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me the right questions," Donahue said. "Everyone who asked before wanted me to either confess or be proud. You're the first one who just wanted to know what happened." What happened, according to Donahue, was more complicated than either version of the story that had been circulating since 1945. The standard account, soldiers overwhelmed by horror, spontaneous rage, 50 executions in 20 minutes, was accurate in its broad outline. But it left out something critical. It left out what happened in the 40 minutes before the first shot was fired. When the Thunderbirds entered Dachau that morning, their commanding officers had immediately recognized the legal situation. Surrendered guards. Geneva Convention. There were specific protocols. Officers began organizing the SS prisoners into a group near one of the outer walls, disarming them, preparing to process them as POWs. This was standard procedure. This was what the training said to do. For approximately 40 minutes, the American soldiers followed their training. Then someone opened one of the rail cars. Not accidentally. Not as part of a search. A soldier climbed up the side of one of the cattle cars and pulled the latch because he wanted to know what was inside. The door slid open. The smell hit the entire compound simultaneously. And then the bodies began to fall. They had been packed so tightly that when the door opened, the ones nearest the entrance simply collapsed outward. Bodies tumbled onto the tracks, skeletal, frozen, stacked against each other so completely that they had been supporting each other in death, the way they had perhaps supported each other in life. The soldier who had opened the door fell backward off the car and hit the ground and did not get up for several minutes. Donahue was standing approximately 30 feet away. "Everything stopped," he told Marcus. "Every sound. Like the world just paused. And then someone started screaming. Not words, just screaming. And that was it." The first shot came from his left. He never saw who fired it. By the time he raised his own rifle, 3 other soldiers had already fired. He described what followed not as a decision, but as a current, something that moved through the group of soldiers, the way electricity moves through water, instant and total, and impossible to step out of once it had started. He fired twice. He was certain of that number because he counted the shots afterward, standing there in the sudden quiet, and there were 2 spent casings at his feet. For 47 years, he had told no one. Not his wife, not his children, not the VA psychiatrist he saw twice in 1953, before stopping because the psychiatrist kept using the word guilt, and Donahue kept thinking that wasn't quite the right word for what he was feeling. "It wasn't guilt," he told Marcus. "Guilt is when you know you did something wrong and you feel bad about it. What I felt was more like I did something wrong and I understood exactly why I did it, and I couldn't separate those 2 things. I couldn't put them in different boxes. They just lived in the same place inside me for 50 years. Marcus asked him if Patton's decision to protect the soldiers had helped. Donahue was quiet for a long moment. "Patton saved my life in the practical sense," he said. "No court-martial, no prison. I went home. I built things. I raised a family. In that sense, yes. But protection is different from absolution. Patton could keep me out of a courtroom. He couldn't keep me out of my own head at 3 a.m. What Donahue's testimony added to the historical record was the 40-minute gap. The period during which the soldiers had followed protocol, had done exactly what they were trained to do, and had then encountered something that their training had never anticipated, not because the training was inadequate, but because nothing could have been adequate. Preparation for a cattle car full of bodies falling onto tracks in the German morning light. Dr. Marcus included Donahue's account in his book. He argued that this detail changed the moral calculus of the Dachau executions in a significant way. The soldiers were not men who had arrived at the camp in a state of uncontrolled rage and immediately begun killing. They had, in fact, demonstrated remarkable restraint for 40 minutes. What broke that restraint was not weakness. It was exposure to a specific concentrated horror that no amount of combat experience could have inoculated them against. The response to Marcus's book split historians down the middle in a way that had not changed in the 30 years since. One side, represented most forcefully by legal scholars and military ethicists, maintained that the 40-minute gap made the executions worse, not better. It demonstrated premeditation. The soldiers knew what they were doing. They had seen the camp, processed it, followed correct procedure for nearly an hour, and then made a conscious choice to abandon that procedure. The fact that an emotional trigger preceded the shooting did not eliminate agency. If anything, it confirmed it. The other side argued that Marcus's account demonstrated precisely the opposite, that the soldiers had genuinely tried to do the right thing, and had been defeated not by their own moral failings, but by the sheer scale of what human beings had done inside those fences for 12 years. That there was a point at which the law could no longer ask anything of a person standing in front of evidence of that magnitude, and that Dachau on April 29, 1945, was that point. Patton, in his private diary, had anticipated both arguments. He had written in the week following his decision a passage that Marcus reproduced in full, because it was, as Marcus noted, the most honest thing anyone in authority had committed to paper about the entire affair. Patton wrote, "The lawyers tell me that law must be consistent to be just, that if we excuse this crime because the victims were monsters, we establish a precedent that will haunt us. They are not wrong. But they are also asking me to tell 23-year-old boys from Pittsburgh and Ohio and Georgia that they must be more disciplined than the entire civilized world managed to be for 12 years. The entire civilized world knew about these camps. We knew. The Red Cross knew. The Vatican knew. The governments of neutral countries knew. And for 12 years, everyone found reasons to look elsewhere. Now I'm supposed to court-martial the first men who actually did something about it." He never sent that passage to anyone. It stayed in the diary. But it became, after Marcus published it, perhaps the most quoted document in every subsequent debate about Dachau, about military justice, about what we are permitted to ask of soldiers and what we are not. James Donahue died in 1998, 6 years after his conversation with Marcus. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette described him as a veteran of the 45th Infantry Division and a retired structural welder. It mentioned that he was survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. It did not mention Dachau. His family had not known until Marcus's book was published, and by then, Donahue had asked them not to discuss it. His daughter gave one interview in 2001 to a documentary filmmaker. She said that after the book came out, her father had seemed not relieved exactly, but lighter, like something he had been carrying at a slight angle for 50 years had finally been set down flat. He said to me, "At least now it's in the record. At least now it's not just inside me." That is where the story of the Dachau executions ends, if it can be said to end anywhere. Not in a courtroom. Not in a definitive verdict about guilt or innocence. Not in the kind of clean moral resolution that history occasionally grudgingly provides. It ends in a retirement home in Pennsylvania, with an old man and a folder he had kept locked for 50 years, finally deciding that the weight of a secret is heavier than the weight of the truth. Patton had been right about one thing above all else. The question was never whether what happened at Dachau was legal. It wasn't. The question was whether the law in that moment, in that place with those specific men, looking at those specific rail cars, was sufficient. Whether it had earned the right to demand compliance from people standing inside an industrial system of murder that the law-abiding world had permitted to operate for 12 years. That question does not have an answer that everyone can live with. It only has the answer that each person alone eventually has to choose. But here is what no one knew in the spring of 1945, What Patton couldn't have known, what Donahue couldn't have known, what even Marcus couldn't fully account for in his book. There was a second investigation, not by the Americans, not by the military. Conducted quietly beginning in 1946 by a West German prosecutor named Friedrich Hartmann, who had obtained copies of the original Inspector General's documents through channels that have never been fully explained. Hartmann's investigation reached a conclusion that contradicted everything Patton had put in his response. And in Part 3, we follow that investigation to the document it produced, a document that named names that described exactly who fired which shots that had been ready for prosecution in 1948. And we find out why it was never used, who made that decision, and what they were offered in exchange for their silence. Because it turns out that the cover-up at Dachau went deeper than Patton's desk, much deeper. And the person at the center of it was someone no one in 1945 would have suspected. Friedrich Hartmann was 31 years old when he opened the file. A West German prosecutor, methodical, quiet, the kind of man who ate the same lunch every day and kept his desk in a condition that his colleagues described as almost unsettling in its order. He had survived the war as a teenager in Hamburg, had watched his city burn from a shelter while Allied bombers reduced the streets above him to rubble, and had emerged from that experience with a conviction so total it had shaped every professional decision he made afterward. That law was the only wall between civilization and what he had seen happen when civilization collapsed. He believed this the way other men believed in God. Absolutely. Without reservation, without exceptions. In the spring of 1946, a package arrived at his office in Munich. No return address. Inside 73 pages of documents, witness statements, photographs, an internal American military investigation report marked inconclusive, except that someone had attached a handwritten note to the front page that read in German. This was not inconclusive. Read page 41. Page 41 contained a list of names. 11 American soldiers identified by rank, unit, and service number whom investigators had determined fired shots at surrendered SS guards on April 29, 1945 at Dachau Concentration Camp. The identification was based on spent casing analysis, witness cross-referencing, and in 3 cases, voluntary statements made by the soldiers themselves in the immediate aftermath of the liberation before anyone had thought to tell them to stop talking. James Donahue's name was on page 41. So were 10 others. Hartmann read the file in one sitting. Then he read it again. Then he did something that surprised even his own staff. He closed the folder, placed it in his desk drawer, locked the drawer, and went home for the evening without telling anyone what he had received. He ate dinner. He slept. He came back the next morning, unlocked the drawer, and began building a case. It took him 2 years. By 1948, Hartmann had a prosecution file that his supervisor later described as the most thorough document she had seen in 20 years of legal practice. He had corroborated every name on the list through independent evidence. He had located 9 of the 11 soldiers. 2 had died in the years since the war, 1 in an accident, 1 by suicide, though the suicide had never been publicly connected to Dachau. He had drafted extradition requests under the emerging framework of international law that the Nuremberg trials had begun to establish. He had, in short, built the legal case that the American Inspector General's office had chosen not to build. Then he walked into his supervisor's office and put the file on her desk. Her name was Ingrid Schreiber. She had been a judge before the war, had survived the Nazi period by becoming invisible, not collaborating, not resisting, simply making herself as professionally unremarkable as possible until it was over. She was 54 years old in 1948, and she had seen enough of what happened when individuals decided that their personal moral calculus superseded the law to last several lifetimes. She read the file in front of him. All of it. It took 2 hours. Hartmann sat across from her desk and waited. When she finished, she set the last page down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and she looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. "You understand what this file is," she said. "A prosecution," he said. "No," she said. "It's a grenade, and the question is not whether to throw it. The question is which direction. What Schreiber understood with the clarity of someone who had spent the previous 3 years watching the Allied occupation navigate the impossible terrain of post-war Germany was that Hartmann's file existed at the intersection of 3 forces that had no interest in seeing it become a public trial. The American military, which had already classified the original investigation and had every political reason to keep it buried. The West German government, which was in the process of constructing its relationship with the United States on a foundation of mutual interest and could not afford to antagonize its primary protector over an incident that Germany had no moral standing to prosecute in the first place. And the broader international legal community, which was still in the early fragile stages of establishing the precedents that would become the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and which recognized that a public trial of American soldiers for executing SS guards would produce a legal precedent that could be weaponized in directions nobody wanted. If you file this, Schreiber said, and it goes to trial, the defense will argue that SS guards at a death camp forfeited their right to prisoner of war protections by their participation in crimes against humanity. That argument has real legal force right now in this moment when Nuremberg is still fresh. And if that argument succeeds, if a court rules that certain categories of people can be executed after surrender because of what they did before surrender, you will have built into international law a provision that every future war criminal will use to justify killing prisoners. Hartmann sat with that for a moment. And if I don't file, he said, 11 men who committed murder go unpunished. And the message is that murder is acceptable if the victims were evil enough. Yes, Schreiber said. That is exactly the choice. She did not tell him what to do. She was careful about that careful, in a way that suggested she had thought about this moment before he walked in, perhaps had known the file was coming through channels she was not prepared to discuss with him. She simply laid out the terrain and left him standing in it. Hartmann took the file home that night. He sat at his kitchen table until 2 in the morning. He thought about his supervisor's argument. He thought about the legal precedent problem. He thought about page 41 and the 11 names on it and what those men were doing right now, presumably living in American cities, working jobs, raising children, carrying what they carried in whatever private way people carry things that cannot be spoken aloud. He thought about the 40,000 people who had died at Dachau. He thought about the 30,000 who had survived. He thought about the fact that not a single SS guard who had served at Dachau had at that point faced any legal accountability whatsoever. Not from the Americans, not from the Germans, not from any court, anywhere. The men who had run the gas chambers, who had conducted the medical experiments, who had designed and maintained 12 years of industrial murder were scattered across West Germany and Austria, and in some cases South America, and the machinery for finding and prosecuting them was only just beginning to be assembled. He put the file back in his briefcase. He went to sleep. The next morning, he made 2 decisions. The first decision was that he would not file the extradition requests. Not because the case wasn't solid, it was. Not because the men hadn't committed what any reasonable legal definition would classify as murder they had, but because Schreiber was right about the precedent, and Hartmann was enough of a lawyer to understand that a bad precedent embedded in international law during its foundational period would cause more harm over the following century than 11 unprosecuted killings, however unjust that calculation felt. The second decision was that he would keep the file. He did not destroy it. He did not return it to whatever American official had presumably sent it to him anonymously in the first place. He kept it locked in a fireproof cabinet in his office, updated it periodically, as he tracked what happened to the men on page 41, and left it there for 26 years. When he retired in 1974, he transferred the file to the Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, the Institute for Contemporary History, with a cover letter that specified it was not to be opened until 20 years after his death. Hartmann died in 1981. The file was opened in 2001. Dr. Harold Marcus, the same historian who had interviewed James Donahue in 1992, was given access to the Hartmann file in the spring of 2002. He spent 3 weeks in Munich reading it. He later said that it was the most disorienting archival experience of his professional life, because it contained information that forced him to revise conclusions he had published and defended for a decade. The most significant revision concerned the source of the anonymous package that had arrived at Hartman's office in 1946. Hartman had attached to the file's interior cover a single index card written in his precise, small handwriting. It read, "Source identified March 1949 through indirect means. Not recorded here to protect the individual who acted from conscience at significant personal risk. Source was American. Rank, senior officer. Motive believed the inconclusive finding was a corruption of justice, and that a proper legal process, even if it ultimately failed, was preferable to administrative burial. Source disagreed with the decision to suppress. Sent the file to me because he believed a German court was more likely than an American one to handle it without political interference. He was wrong about that, but he was right about everything else. Marcus spent considerable effort trying to identify the senior American officer who had sent the file to Hartman. He narrowed it to 3 candidates based on who had access to the original investigation documents and who had expressed dissent through official channels in 1945. He was never able to confirm which of the 3 it was. All 3 were dead by the time he began looking. But the existence of that index card changed everything about how Marcus understood the Dachau cover-up, because it meant the suppression of the investigation had not been unanimous. Somewhere inside the American military command, at least one senior officer had looked at what Patton did and decided it was wrong, not the executions, but the burial of the investigation. The administrative fiction of inconclusiveness, the decision to protect soldiers by erasing the legal process rather than running it and accepting whatever outcome it produced. That officer had tried in the only way available to him to correct it. He had sent the file to Germany. He had trusted a foreign legal system to do what his own system had refused to do, and the foreign system had looked at it, understood its implications, and made the same choice Patton had made, that this particular set of facts in this particular moment was too dangerous to put before a court. So the file went into a cabinet, and the cabinet sat in an office in Munich for 26 years. And then it sat in an archive for another 20. And in 2001, it was opened, and a historian read it and wrote about it, and the names on page 41 were finally for the first time part of the public record. James Donahue had been dead for 3 years by then. His daughter read Marcus's second book. She called Marcus and spoke to him for 40 minutes. At the end of the conversation, she said something that Marcus included in the book's acknowledgments, because he couldn't think of a better place to put it. She said, "My father knew his name was somewhere. He didn't know where, but he always said he could feel it, feel that there was a document somewhere that had his name on it and told the truth. He said it wasn't a comfortable feeling, but it was better than the alternative. He said the alternative was feeling like it had never happened at all. Like 40,000 people died and 30,000 people were saved, and he was there for all of it, and there was no record anywhere that connected him to any of it. He said he could live with being on a list. He couldn't have lived with being erased." In Part 4, we follow the men whose names did not appear in any newspaper until 2001, and we ask the question that Patton, Hartman, Schreiber, and Marcus all circled around but never directly answered. Not whether the executions were legal, not whether Patton was right to cover them up, but whether the soldiers themselves, the ones who lived, who built careers and families and ordinary lives, were better or worse served by a justice system that chose understanding over accountability. Because 3 of the men on page 41 left written records of their own. And what those records say about guilt, about law, about what it means to be protected by a decision you didn't make, is the most unsettling part of this entire story. And it begins with a letter that one of them wrote in 1971 and addressed to a man who had been dead for 16 years. From a welder from Pittsburgh who raised his rifle on an April morning in 1945, to a German prosecutor who locked a file in a cabinet for 26 years, to a historian who spent 3 weeks in a Munich archive revising everything he thought he knew. This story has traveled further than any of its participants could have anticipated. We know what happened at Dachau. We know what Patton did. We know about page 41 and Hartman's file, and the anonymous senior officer who sent it across the Atlantic because he believed that administrative burial was its own form of injustice. And we ended part 3 with 3 men on that list who left written records of their own records that asked in different ways the same question. What does it mean to be protected by a decision you never made and could never undo? That question has one answer that nobody expected. And it comes from a letter written in 1971 and addressed to a man who had been dead for 16 years. George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was 60 years old. He never faced any professional consequence for his handling of the Dachau investigation. He was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery alongside the soldiers of the Third Army, which was by all accounts exactly where he would have chosen to be. History has treated him with the complexity he deserved, neither fully condemning the cover-up nor fully excusing it, understanding that the man who made that decision was the same man who had vomited outside a Dachau barrack and ordered German civilians to bury the dead with their own hands. James Donahue, as we know, went home to Pittsburgh, built a career, built a family, and carried his silence for 50 years before setting it down for Dr. Marcus in a retirement home in 1992. He was the one who spoke. But the file that Marcus accessed in 2001 contained records of the others, the 10 additional names on page 41, the men whose stories had never been requested by a historian, never offered to a documentary filmmaker, never spoken into any record at all. 3 of them left written material behind. Not memoirs, not public statements. Private documents that their families donated to various archives after their deaths, not knowing what they contained, not knowing that a file in Munich cross-referenced their father's names with a mourning in Bavaria, that the official record had classified as inconclusive. The first was a journal kept by a man named Robert Castellano, a former machine gunner from New Jersey, who had worked as a high school history teacher for 31 years after the war. His journal, donated to the Rutgers University Archive by his son in 1994, covered the years 1946 through 1979. The entry for April 29th appeared every single year without exception. Not a long entry, usually 2 or 3 sentences. But every year on the anniversary, Castellano sat down and wrote something about that morning. The early entries were raw. 1947. 12 years they ran it. 12 years, and we had 45 minutes before someone opened a door. 1952. Told a student today that history doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes. Couldn't finish the sentence. By the 1960s, the entries had become more philosophical, less jagged. 1963. The question isn't whether we were right. The question is whether rightness is even the right category for what happened inside those gates. And in 1971, the year he addressed an imaginary letter to Patton, he wrote something that Marcus reproduced in full because it was, in his judgment, the most precise description of what Patton's protection had actually meant to the men it covered. Castellano wrote, "Dear General, you made a choice for us that we didn't ask for and couldn't refuse. You decided that we deserved understanding more than we deserved judgment. And maybe you were right, I genuinely don't know. But here is what I want to tell you. 26 years later, the protection didn't stop the accounting. It just moved it inside. Every man who was in that compound on April 29th has been his own court-martial ever since. We just hold the sessions privately on dates nobody else marks on their calendar. I don't know if that's better or worse than what a real trial would have done. I've spent 26 years trying to figure it out. I'll let you know when I get there." He never got there. Castellano died in 1986. The journal entry for April 29, 1985, his last, was 4 words. Still don't know. Present. That phrase, still don't know present, became something of an organizing principle for Marcus's second book, because it captured more precisely than any legal or historical framework what the Dachau executions had done to the men who carried them. Not guilt in the simple sense. Not pride. Not resolution. Presence. An ongoing, unresolved attendance at a question that the law had declined to answer, and that private conscience was not equipped to answer alone. The second written record came from a man named Thomas Whelan, a former infantryman from rural Kentucky who had farmed the same land his father had farmed and his grandfather before that. Whelan had written one document about Dachau in 1958, a single page apparently written in one sitting, and then folded into an envelope and placed inside a family Bible where it remained until his granddaughter found it while cleaning out the farmhouse in 2003. She sent a copy to Marcus after reading his second book. Whelan's page was simpler than Castellano's journal. He was not a teacher. He was not given to philosophical framing. He wrote in the direct, unornamented language of a man who said what he meant and trusted that the meaning was sufficient. He wrote that he had been present at Dachau, that he had fired his weapon, that he had not been prosecuted, and that he believed the non-prosecution was correct, not because what he did was right, but because punishing him would not have made it righter. He wrote that he thought about the men he had killed approximately once a week, that he did not lose sleep over it, the way people in movies lost sleep over things, that it was more like a weight he had learned to carry the way you learn to carry anything heavy by adjusting your posture until it becomes part of how you move through the world. And then at the bottom of the page, a single sentence that his granddaughter said she had read 40 times since finding it, and still was not certain she fully understood. The ones I feel for are the 30,000 who had to watch us do it. That sentence stopped Marcus entirely when he first read it, because it identified something that the entire subsequent debate about the Dachau executions, the legal arguments, the precedent questions Hartman's file, Patton's diary had almost entirely omitted. The 30,000 survivors who had been present in that compound, who had watched American soldiers execute surrendered SS guards, who had in some cases cheered, who had in other cases wept for reasons nobody had thought to ask about, who had been liberated from one form of violence and immediately witnessed another, and who had then spent the following decades largely absent from a debate that was fundamentally about what their suffering had done to other people. The historical record on the survivors' responses to the executions is sparse and largely anecdotal. What we know is that reactions varied enormously from relief to horror, to a kind of complicated, ungovernable emotion that resisted any single label. What we also know is that several survivor testimonies collected in the 1980s and 1990s mentioned the executions not as a secondary event, but as a primary memory of Liberation Day equal in emotional intensity to the moment the gates opened. One survivor, a Polish man named Alexander Nowak, who had been imprisoned at Dachau for 3 years, gave a testimony in 1988 in which he described watching the executions from across the compound. He said that his first thought when the shooting started was that the Americans were also going to kill the prisoners, that liberation had been a mistake, a misunderstanding, and that the killing would continue until everyone was dead. It took him several minutes to understand what was actually happening. He said that when he understood, he felt something that he described in the testimony as worse than fear and better than hope, and that he had never found a word in any language for what that feeling was. Nowak's testimony was included in the Hartman file. Hartman had found it through the World Jewish Congress archive and added it as an appendix without comment in 1967. The fact that he was still actively updating the file 20 years after deciding not to prosecute suggests that Hartman himself never fully resolved the question he had locked in that cabinet. He kept adding material, kept thinking, kept returning to the same set of facts and finding that they would not sit still. He died having never published anything about it. His only public statement on the Dachau executions was made in a 1979 interview for a West German legal journal in response to a question about the limits of international law. He said, "The law is at its most important precisely in the moments when it is hardest to follow. But important and sufficient are different things. Sometimes the law is important and still not sufficient. What you do in those moments defines you more completely than anything else. I have spent 30 years thinking about what I did in one of those moments. I hope it was right. I am not certain. Here is what we know with certainty gathered across 4 parts and 70 years of history. 40,000 people died at Dachau. 30,000 survived. 50 SS guards were executed after surrender. 11 American soldiers fired the shots. 0 were prosecuted. 1 German prosecutor built a case and chose not to file it. 1 senior American officer sent a file to Germany because he believed silence was its own injustice. And three men on page 41, a history teacher, a farmer, and a welder, spent the rest of their lives holding their own private sessions of a court that never officially convened. From a cattle car opened on an April morning in Bavaria, to a file in a Munich archive, to a granddaughter reading a folded page inside a family Bible. 50 years later, this story moved the way all the deepest historical questions move, not toward resolution, but toward greater clarity about why resolution was never going to be possible. Patton protected his soldiers. Hartman protected the law. And the 30,000 who watched from across the compound protected something that nobody thought to ask them about for 40 years. The question Dachau leaves us with is not whether the executions were right or wrong. History has given us the tools to argue both sides indefinitely. The question is simpler and harder than that. It is the question that Robert Castellano wrote on a page every April 29th for 38 years and never answered and showed up for anyway. What do you do when the law, justice, and basic decency all arrive at the same moment and cannot agree? If this story stayed with you, share it. Leave a comment with what you would have done in Patton's position. And subscribe, because next week, we tell the story of another decision made in a single moment that history spent decades trying to understand. Because that is what this channel is for, not the easy stories, not the ones that end with clear heroes and clear answers. The ones that force you to sit with the question long after the video is over. Just like Castellano did, just like Hartman did, just like every honest person does when they finally look at what human beings are capable of in both directions and refuse to look away. The most important thing any soldier, any judge, any human being can do in the face of impossible circumstances is exactly what Castellano wrote on that last page in 1985. Not resolution, not certainty, just presence. Still here, still asking, still unwilling to pretend the question is smaller than it is.